Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video I'm back talking about Australian Survivor once again, here doing another ranking I've done for Survivor US. Beforehand, here I'll be doing a penultimate juror ranking for Australian Survivor. So this will be a ranking of every player that got voted out 2 rounds before the end of the game. Obviously final 4 boots in situations where there's a final 2, and final 5 boots in situations where there's a final 3. And I'll be ranking them based on how they played on the individual season that they were a penultimate juror. And also I will be keeping this to just the network 10 seasons of Australian Survivor, being it within the modern era of the show. So with that, let's start the ranking itself. We got 9 players to be ranking here. Let's start off at number 9. The worst game played by penultimate juror ends up being Cara from Australian Survivor Brains versus Brawn. And Cara's game is just a complete mess. It's one where, there are actually good aspects of her game. Obviously, she is working alongside George for most of the season, and through that, she does go along with a lot of the plans that George does throughout the season. And in that fact, I do feel like there are things to credit her for. However, obviously, I do think George was the main strategist of the two, to where I give him a lot more credit for a lot of the moves they put off together. And even then, there are points where he just simply doesn't let her in on the plan. Now, I will say, obviously, a major reason why she is towards the bottom of this list is because of how benefited she was by twists. Obviously, she does get voted out in episode 6, only to return to the game. Now, I will also say that in that situation, she wasn't genuinely going home. I mean, she goes home simply because she plays an idol on George to send herself home, which, again, it's just kind of wonky how to assess that from a game perspective, and that she technically should have been safe for that round, but she decides to sacrifice her game for George. But again, she does technically get voted out there. Even beyond that, I mean, she does also essentially get voted out at the Laura Boot tribal as well, where that was a tribal where she gets saved completely out of her control. She was being booted with a vast majority of the votes until George is able to play a secret idol on her, ends up saving her. And beyond that, again, her game is just really sloppy. Again, obviously she's on the bottom of George on the original Brains tribe. She messes up the plan that sends Big D home at the swap. She does end up actually being part of the majority on the swap tribe following that, but again, she proceeds to be left out of plans at the merge vote and at the Gerald vote. And after being saved by an idol at the Laura Boot tribal, she does then proceed to be in the majority following that, only being taken out in a 2-1-1 vote, which is obviously a very wonky situation there. One where, again, I actually am kind of impressed with the fact that she does vote for George in that situation, it being a move that I think is actually in her best interest. And while I do think it's definitely a move in the best interest of George and Haley, I do think for Cara it's a bit more questionable. But either way, I mean, I do think Cara's game is just a complete mess. Again, there are definitely points where she is in the majority, and I will give her some credit for that. But the fact that, again, she got voted out in the pre-merge, was supposed to be voted out post-merge, and it's just in and out of the majority throughout most of the game. Again, it's enough for me to land her as the worst penultimate juror here, being here number 9. At number 8, we're moving on to another penultimate juror that got technically voted out of the game, though this one was a person that I think get voted out in a bit of a wonky situation to begin with, and that person is KJ from Blood vs. Water. And KJ's game is just a very strange one to assess. Now, I will say, I actually think Cara was probably in the majority, more so than KJ was for more of her season, where KJ just kind of seems to be clinging towards the bottom of whatever power structure she's a part of for really most of the season, to where while she seems to be relatively safe early on, by the time Sophie gets swapped over to her tribe, she becomes an easy person to have the votes split on, where I believe she does have votes split on her for the remainder of the tribals that she goes to in the pre-merge. She then also proceeds to be on the bottom at the merge itself, and eventually does get voted out mid-game. Now, I will say again, like, her getting voted out there is a very wonky circumstance. It's one where she got voted out at a vote that happened immediately after the Jordy vote, to where she had no chance of saving herself through immunity, no chance to campaign. And I think that is definitely a wonky circumstance there, to where that's just extremely abnormal. Now, after returning to the game, now she does end up returning to the game, though in that position, she doesn't really have much of a chance at winning at that point. I mean, while she could definitely get to the end, I don't think she could really win a jury vote. I don't think many people really respected her at that point, but still, again, she's involved in taking out Sam. She is a vote against David when he goes out. But again, she is involved in taking out Jordan and taking out Sam, even though, to be fair, the Jordan vote was due to a twist anyway. But still, she ends up voting out Jordy, which, to be fair, is a pretty misguided move. And obviously, she ends up being in the situation at the final 5 where she essentially eventually votes herself out. It was a pretty crazy vote there where she misguidedly puts her votes on Josh instead of Mark. But really, again, KJ's game is a bit tough to assess. Again, I do think I would give Cara a bit more credit for staying in the majority for more periods in the game. However, I do feel like Cara obviously has two situations where she should have essentially been voted out before her ultimate elimination. Well, I feel like KJ's vote off mid-game was one that was a bit more unlucky, and even it happens much deeper in the game than Cara's first vote off, to where, again, I do think it is actually kind of close, just because I think Cara's game just naturally is a bit stronger, though I think it is that minute difference that puts KJ above Cara here at number 8. At number 7, we're moving on to a player that I do find tough to assess, because I think when I think of this person as a player in the grand scheme of Australian Survivor, I do look at them pretty highly, yet I think their game on this specific season is very rocky, and that person is Brooke from Australian Survivor All-Stars. So yeah, I do feel like Brooke here is one that obviously she just loses control post-emerge. I mean, post-emerge, she's really just barely hanging on, obviously surviving through either immunity wins or straight up, like, she does get essentially saved by a twist during the Zach boot round, and that being a situation where, had all those immunities not come into play, I do think Brooke is in a lot of danger there. And she literally has a 3 immunity stretch before being taken out at Final 4. Again, she would have been booted in most of those rounds had that not been the case. So again, like, her post-merge is very rocky there. However, her pre-merge is very strong. I mean, she is in the majority lines the entire time, being alongside Lockie and really just running the game on her respective tribe, to where while she does get outplayed by David at the Daisy vote and ends up misguidingly playing her idol on him, beyond that, she does end up really running the show in the pre-merge, which again makes her game this massive dichotomy there of it having a really strong pre-merge but a very lackluster post-merge. So I do think she is in the same ballpark as the next player that we'll be talking about, and probably had a better pre-merge than that respective player, though I think that person had a better post-merge, to where they at least got a lot more done in the post-merge, while Brooke was just kind of hanging on the bottom and surviving through immunity wins. So again, for me, that was enough to have Brooke below the next person here at number 7. Now, number 6, we're moving on to, again, a similar penultimate juror in my mind, a player that has a similar trajectory in the game, and that player is Luke from Championship Contenders 2. And again, I think Luke's trajectory in the game is very similar. Obviously, post-merge, he does also go on this big immunity run in situations where he probably gets voted out in many of those votes, of winning 3 immunities before he eventually gets voted out at 4. But outside that, again, I think there's points where his game is better than Brooke's. I think there's points where his game is worse than Brooke's. Now, early on in the game, again, I don't think he has as much of a stranglehold in the game as Brooke does. I mean, while he is in the majority and, again, does flip the vote onto Susie and proceeds to be in the initial majority on the Champions tribe, I don't think he was as much on the top of that tribe in the way that Brooke was. And obviously he gets a very unfortunate swap and ends up having to play from the bottom into the merge. But no, that's something obviously that I don't really detract from his game, considering it was just unlucky that he got swapped in that position. But even then, there he's able to get through the Sam and the Sarah votes unscathed. But again, I do think his post-merge ends up being stronger than Brooke's. Again, Brooke was on the bottom the entire post-merge phase of the game. Luke was actually able to get some stuff done in the post-merge. Obviously, being part of the initial majority that takes out Andy and Shaun, and while he does get blindsided at the David vote, he proceeds to get back with the majority and working alongside the champions again, only to then flip alongside Abby and taking out Simon. Though obviously it is at that point where he does start to become a target, but even then, he's at least still in the majority. He's still voting people out of the game, unlike Brooke. And obviously he has his move at Final 5, which is a very impressive maneuver to pull off, even though it obviously doesn't end up working to his favor. But him saving Pia by using his advantage and tricking Abby into making a 2-on-1 vote is, again, a very impressive play there, to where, again, I do think Luke's game, for me, I think I end up having him above Brooke. Even though I think Brooke's pre-merge is stronger than Luke's, I think Luke's post-merge is much stronger than Brooke's, to where, again, it's enough for me to put him here at number 6. Now, number 5, we're moving on to a player that has another very rocky game, a game that I think is probably less impressive than the likes of Luke and Brooke, though also probably a game that I have less issues with than those two, and that person is Nina from Heroes vs. Villains. And Nina is someone that, unlike Luke and Brooke, who I think were running the game at points in their seasons, Nina wasn't necessarily, she was definitely within the majority. Throughout the entire pre-merge, she's never really in danger, being in a solid position on the original Heroes tribe and being swapped into a pretty fortunate position as well, where her and Haley are looked at as the swings coming into the majority vote. And even beyond that, again, she has her alliance with like Sam and David that seems to be the true majority in that group. Though obviously post-merge, again, like Brooke, her game does kind of crumble, where her side ends up losing the numbers and she loses David, Flick, and Sam all in a row. Though I think it's beyond that, where again, her game is better than Brooke's. Again, she's able to get back in the majority in voting out Shawnee. She is also part of the Haley vote. And while she does have like a situation where she's technically get voted out, that in itself was a very rocky vote off, to where Simon was the target for most of that round, only for it to shift at the very last second with George telling Liz to shift the vote in case of some other plurality vote plan happening, which again, I think is a very unfortunate circumstance itself. But again, I think her game is again one where, again, the likes of Luke and Brooke were running the show a bit more than Nina, though I think they really lose control of the game a lot more than Nina does, where while Nina again is on the bottom for a few votes, she is able to get back in the majority for a bit. While she isn't this like big orchestrator of many moves in the game, she's at least able to avoid being targeted for a decent chunk of the merge phase of the game. And even when she eventually goes home, she comes extremely close to staying, where had George known that it was a final three, I think there's a serious chance that Nina does survive that round. So all around, I do think Nina's game is, again, pretty solid through and through. Again, I think she doesn't lose control of the game as much as Luke and Brooke do, to where, for me, it's enough to put Nina here at number 5. Now, number 4, we're moving on to someone that I'm surprised is this high on the list, but it's a player that, on what ended up being a very dynamic season, ended up playing probably one of the most consistent games of the bunch, and that player is Raymond from Titans versus Rebels. And again, Raymond's a player that I think when you look at this on paper, again, it feels weird to be saying that Raymond is better than the likes of Nina and Luke and Brooke, who again, I think are better players in the grand scheme of Australian Survivor. However, I do think Raymond's game on this specific season is actually pretty decent. While he is someone that gets so many votes over the course of this season, he is someone that actually has one of the best voting records on this season. Again, in a season where the majority is flipped constantly, he actually stayed within the majority for most of it. Obviously, he is working alongside Ferris for a lot of it, and through that, their voting records end up staying largely the same for most of their run, though he does proceed to be the swing vote in taking out Jaden, while also then being the sole vote in taking out Valeria, which obviously you can mention the fact that, he got voted out unanimously and saved by an advantage, though obviously that was a situation where he wasn't going to be voted out. He was never really in danger until he put himself in danger to use the advantage, so I don't really fault him anything for that. Now, I will say the thing that I do fault him for is the fact that he never seemed to actually want to turn against Ferris, a situation where I do think he needed to go on to win the game. I do think the fact that he just seemed resigned to going to the end of Ferris and never really seemed to branch out to make deals with the likes of Caroline and Mark in the end game that ends up putting him in danger at the final 4, again, is definitely a flaw there, though really Raymond's game, again, I do think is largely consistent. Again, we've talked about a lot of people who lost control during major portions of the game. Again, both Luke and Brooke were massive targets throughout the post-merge. Nina lost control during the early merge phase, and even then was kind of barely hanging on at points. Raymond is someone that, someone that definitely was looked at as a potential target for people not on his side, was still within the majority for most of the game, where again, he's part of the initial majority on the Rebels tribe and voting out PETA, and would have been on the majority and voting out Rihanna had that been a natural vote. Had that gone on to be an eventual vote, he obviously is on the outs during the Garrick vote, and to be fair, does very much get benefited by the episode 10 twist, though by the time the merge, obviously he's part of Ferris's alliance that takes out Winna and proceeds to be in the majority after the Valeria vote until his eventual elimination. Like, Raymond's game is just a largely consistent one, to where while I think there are definitely holes with his game, especially in terms of how is he going to win the game, I do feel like his navigation through the game is actually pretty solid, to where again, it's enough for me to put him here at number 4. Now, number 3, and it is kind of funny how the top 3 on this list end up actually being the first 3 penultimate jurors in the show's history. And funnily, we're also going to be starting another trend within that, where at number 3, I do have Shawnee from Champions vs. Contenders, obviously the 3rd season of the show. And Shawnee's Champions vs. Contenders game is a pretty solid one. It's one where she is in a pretty good good position throughout the entire pre-swap phase of the game. I mean, she is in the initial majority and has a very core group of allies that really just holds the numbers throughout the early portions of the game and is really dictating where the votes are going. Again, she's part of the group that leads the charge against Matt and Steve. She is deciding vote and taking out Tegan and eventually Zach and Paige, though obviously she does get pretty unfortunate in her swap position to where she swapped into the bottom, though ends up scraping through that. Though coming into the merge, I do feel like her game is a bit more up and down to where while initially she is in a decent position in the sense that she's not being targeted by anybody and she is voting with the majority, she's simply on the bottom of whatever power structure she's a part of and I'm to be picked off to where again she does end up being part of the Matt Rogers vote, which is obviously this massive blindside there. Biggest move of the season, though also not really a move that I feel like she was that integral to, where I feel like the likes of Benji and even like Monica probably played a bigger role in making that vote go through than Shawnee, but still again was a part of it, only to be blindsided the following round where again she's once again on the outs when Benji goes home, where Monica and Brian flip back, though after that she's finally part of this core alliance that seems to be running the mid-merge phase of the game, and her teaming up with Brian, Monica, and Fenella to take out the likes of Steve and attempt to take out Shaun, though obviously that plan gets foiled. So we do see her eventually flip at the final 5 in a position where it's a bit of a questionable move to do so at that time. Or while I think she definitely has to worry about Monica and Brian taking her out at 3, I do think making the move at 5 is just giving power to Shane and Shaun, who are bigger threats than Brian and Monica, though to be fair, at the final 4, even when she gets taken out, she does get pretty unlucky in what happens there, where Brian wins immunity, which caused her to have to go to the 2v2 situation she was in, which to be fair is not a terrible position if she knew how to make fire, but she doesn't, so she was essentially screwed. But again, Shawnee's game is solid. I do think it's a game where, again, she's very well positioned pre-swap. She plays pretty well from the bottom, while also regaining control in the back portions of the game, and then gets pretty unfortunate at the very, very end, where it's all around a pretty solid game, especially for a list like this, where while I do wish she had a bit more control in the post-merge phase of the game, which I do feel like the next 2 people we'll be talking about definitely had, I still feel like her game as a whole is solid enough to be here number 3. Now number 2, and again, the top 2 are the first 2 penultimate jurors of the series, and keeping with the trend here, at number 2, the second best penultimate juror ends up being Michelle from Australian Survivor 2017, obviously the second season of the show. And again, Michelle's game is essentially a better version of Shawnee's. I do feel like she's someone that again was in the majority early on in the game. I will say I think actually Shawnee's pre-swap game is probably better than Michelle's, where while again Michelle is in the majority, I do feel like she is not really in this power position that Shawnee was. It's where again Michelle was closer to the likes of Luke and Jericho, who weren't really running the show until the post-swap. Though once we get that first swap, again, she does end up being in the majority that takes out Jackie and Kent, though then proceeds to get swapped into a pretty unfortunate position of being on the bottom. Though again, plays the Ben boot round pretty well there and being able to get people to turn on Ben. And coming into the merge, again, I think she has a pretty strong merge phase of the game to where she's really in the majority for most of it. Again, taking out Jared and Annalise and being one of the people leading the charge against Henry. She ends up being blindsided in a 3-2 vote, though after that ends up becoming a major number within the majority group and leading the charge against taking out Sarah and Luke and Ziggy, though obviously plays the Locky boot round pretty wonkily to where she kind of ends up being tricked by him into putting her vote into Peter, though really that didn't really play much of a factor into much. Obviously she gets taken out at the final 4 in a situation where she does at least get to fire making. I do think she plays that round particularly poorly and how she ends up making it kind of obvious to Jericho that she's not on his side, to where I do think she definitely could have played that round better, but still again she barely ends up being a penultimate juror here, to where I think that's something to give her credit for as well. And again, just overall, like Michelle's game is very solid. Again, it's one where again she's really in the majority for most of her run. The only points where she's not is in the first vote where they take out Joan. Again, she's on the bottom post swap. Again, that was just due to an unlucky swap, and then got the 3-2 vote. So again, it's a pretty solid game, especially amongst the people that we've talked about so far. So again, that's enough to put her here number 2. Now number 1, the best penultimate juror of Australian Survivor ends up coming from the first season of the show, and here we do have Flick. And really, I feel like Flick is number 1 by quite a bit. Now, I think the one thing to detract from Flick is I do think Flick gets very fortunate at the episode 5 tribal, to where again we had this like tie between her and Connor, and just the entire situation surrounding that vote is pretty bad from her point of view. However, I think outside that, I think her game is extremely strong. I mean, it's one where again she's in the majority the entire time, really being part of this group that's really running the show. I mean, essentially in the pre-merge, again, her game is very similar to the likes of Shaun, being a major number in the majority group. And obviously she gets a very fortunate swap to where she's able to run the show during those rounds as well, though coming into the merge, she continues to hold that control. Again, unlike the likes of Shaun, who loses control at points in the merge, Flick is someone that's really in the majority for the rest of her run until her boot round. I mean, she is someone that is part of the initial group that's really running the show. Obviously makes the big move in flipping against Brooke, which in itself is a questionable move. I definitely feel like it's one that ends up costing her game, especially with her being unable to flip over Christy for any of the following votes. Even in that situation, she's able to skate by to the final 4, and again, like, seemed to know what her optimal move was. She was just unable and actually getting Christy to flip. But again, it's just all around, like, for Penultimate Juror, a very solid game. I mean, again, like, the big knock against her for me would be episode 5, where again, I think early on her game is a little bit sloppy, but following that, she recovers very well and ends up playing a pretty dominant game up until the final 7. And even at that point ends up seeming to know what she's supposed to do, though is just enabled and actually getting that through. But again, an all-around pretty solid game, especially for a Penultimate Juror. So for me, she was the easy number 1 on this list. But with that, again, that is my ranking of all the Penultimate Jurors in Australian Survivor history up to this point. Now, moving forward again, I will continue to do arbitrary rankings like this for all the different Survivor shows. So just stay tuned for more of the same style content you can expect from the channel. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.